Have you ever wondered what would have happened if the amazing Digital Circus had never ended? Or what would have occurred if its story had continued in one way or another? What if the Digital Circus characters actually met their human versions? Wouldn't the interaction between Pomni and Abigail be pretty weird? How many things would they have to say to each other? Well, in this completely original AU, that is exactly the idea being explored. What if there had been one more episode of the amazing Digital Circus? Besides, the reason Pomni decides to look for Abigail is much darker than it seems, and trust me, when you find out the real reason she's looking for her, you'll understand that none of this was a mere coincidence. All of this takes place exactly 2 years after the ending we saw in the amazing Digital Circus, following the events of episode 9. A lot of time has passed since Caine revealed the truth. None of them were their human selves trapped in a digital world, but rather simple digital copies of the original people. Just as we saw at the beginning of this video, the story begins with the first encounter between Pomni and Abigail. We see how Pomni manages to step out of the screen and begins talking to her. At first, Abigail is completely shocked, and thinking it's all just a figment of her imagination, she decides to play along. However, it doesn't take long for Pomni to prove that it really is her. She starts telling her very intimate things about her life, details that only the two of them could possibly know. And the more they talked and the deeper they delved into those memories, the more Abigail began to realize that whatever was happening, it was completely real. During this conversation, Pomni summarizes all the events we experienced throughout the series, from her arrival in episode 1 to the events of episode 9. She tells her about everything she learned and all the people she lost along the way. She talks about Caine and how he tortured them for so long, about Ragatha, her great friend inside the circus, about Jax, Gangle, and Zubul, as well as all the adventures they went through, even after the chaos of the ending. She also explains what the abstracted were, and what happened when someone lost their sanity inside that digital world, imagining that her human version would have surely tried to keep all the circus inhabitants together and sane as well. That is when Pomni goes silent for a few seconds. After a long pause, she tells Abigail that there is still something very important she hasn't told her. At some point in the conversation, Abigail asks a question that had been hovering in her mind for a while. She asked her why she is there, and why she decided to look specifically for her. That is when Pomni decides to tell her the truth, and it's exactly at that moment when we see her expression change completely, showing a face full of sadness and worry. It is then that Pomni decides to tell her what is really happening inside the Digital Circus. At that moment, we flash back to some events that happened before Pomni went looking for Abigail. Just like we saw in the final episode of the amazing Digital Circus, Kinger had been watching the abstracted for a long time, with a question that kept spinning in his head. Would it really be possible to bring them back? During the 2 years that have passed since then, Kinger has tried 1,001 ways to achieve it, refusing to accept that there was no hope left for them. Kinger decides to talk to Caine and ask him a very important question. He wants to know if he still has the digital copies he used to bring everyone into the Digital Circus. Kinger believes that by using those files, he could give them back their original bodies. Caine replies that over time, those copies stopped being completely stable and began to deteriorate. Even so, he doesn't consider this to be a major issue, thinking that nothing serious will happen. After a vast amount of attempts, the experiment starts showing promising results. Everything seemed to indicate that they were finally going to pull it off. However, during one of those experiments, something goes terribly wrong. Yes, They managed to come back, but not in the way they expected. The abstracted that Kinger was working with lose the appearance we knew and evolve into a much more corporeal form, much closer to the shape they had when they still retained part of their humanity. For a moment, it even seems like the experiment has worked and that at long last, Kinger has managed to bring them back. But that hope is very short-lived. Even though they regained a more human appearance, their minds never returned with them. The madness that consumed them inside the digital circus is still present, only now it manifests in a much more violent and unpredictable way. We see Kinger staring intently at Queenie in her new appearance. For a few seconds, he can't help but feel hopeful, thinking that he has truly gotten her back. However, as she begins to approach, he realizes that something isn't right. Her gaze no longer conveys the same warmth as before, and her movements are completely unnatural. Plus, it seems she still has traces of the abstraction. That is when Queenie launches her first attack. Without warning, she starts attacking both Caine and Kinger with an aggression never seen before. Caine does everything possible to protect Kinger, using what little resources he has to contain her, and trying to keep the situation under control. However, none of his attempts work. The new Queenie is much stronger, faster, and much more dangerous than any abstracted they had previously faced. Ultimately, Queenie manages to overpower them both. She kidnaps Kinger and severely injures Caine before disappearing with Kinger. During the confrontation, Caine takes critical damage that directly affects the functioning of the digital circus. As a result, he loses a huge portion of the powers he used to maintain absolute control over that world, leaving the circus more vulnerable than ever. Sometime later, the rest of the circus inhabitants find Caine heavily wounded. That's when he explains to them that all the abstracted managed to escape, and they are no longer their usual selves. We return to the present and continue with the conversation between Pomni and Abigail. By this point, Abigail already knows the context surrounding the digital circus and the chaos taking place inside that world. That's when Pomni tells her she needs the help of one specific person. They need to find Kinger's human version. According to Pomni, he was one of the original programmers of the Digital Circus project, and being in the real world, maybe he can still do something to help them. After all, she, Caine, and the rest of the cast have already tried everything to fix the situation, but sadly, they haven't succeeded. Abigail decides to look for him using the specifications Pomni gave her, and as we already know, Kinger lives in that very same town. So she starts looking for him through social media and finally finds him while he's out shopping. Abigail strikes up a brief conversation with him and explains that she knows he worked at CNA alongside a team that was developing an artificial intelligence. The goal of that project was to find a way to keep the human mind active through advanced technology. However, the project ended up being a failure, or at least that's what everyone believed. The artificial intelligence developed its own consciousness, and in secret began building a digital world. Inside that world, it stored Kinger's mind and those of all his co-workers, giving birth to what we know today as the Digital Circus. After telling him the whole history of the Digital Circus and everything that has happened since, Kinger is completely shocked. He can't believe that after so many years, those people are still trapped inside that virtual world. At that moment, his wife overhears the entire conversation. Understanding the gravity of the situation, she decides to join them. Ultimately, Kinger and his wife make the decision to take action and find a way to save everyone who is still trapped in the digital circus. We go back to the past. Some time has already passed since the incident with the abstracted, and the digital circus has undergone massive changes. To begin with, all the vibrant colors that characterize the circus have disappeared. Now the place has a completely grayish look, very similar to what we saw in episodes 8 and 9. However, they don't have time to try to restore it because they are now being hunted by the abstracted, who have become more aggressive than ever. Plus, there's a very important detail. The darkness, which previously seemed to calm them down, no longer has any effect on them. Now, nothing seems able to stop them. Pomni tries to become the moral compass of the group, and together they make an endless number of attempts to return the digital circus to normal. They try different ways to contain the abstracted over and over again, but everything seems to be in vain. After numerous attempts, the group realizes they can no longer fight back against them. Without Kinger and Caine gravely injured, they have no one capable of controlling the situation or finding a solution. Faced with despair, everyone decides to hide and survive as best as they can. Several weeks go by like this, avoiding any encounters with the abstracted. However, as time goes by, Ragatha disappears without a trace. No one knows what became of her or if she's even still alive. From that moment on, only 3 characters remain in the Digital Circus. Desperate to find the way out, Pomni manages to create, from her own mind, a strange white door. Without overthinking it, she decides to walk through it. Upon crossing it, she discovers she has reached cyberspace, a place that exists outside the Digital Circus and the central computer where they were all trapped. That is when she realizes that this space allows her to travel to other places entirely separate from the main system. Realizing this, an idea comes to her. Seek out the human versions of the Digital Circus inhabitants and ask them for help to save those still trapped. And it is precisely that decision that leads her to today's events. She tries for a long time. She wanders the immense cyberspace over and over again, hoping to find someone who can help them. However, due to the vastness of that place and the infinite number of interconnected networks that exist within it, it proves practically impossible for her to find the right person. Despite all those failures, Pom refuses to give up. She decides to stop searching using logic and instead trust her instincts. So she simply follows her heart. And, against all odds, that heart ends up guiding her straight to Abigail's computer, bringing us back to the events we saw at the beginning of the story. We see what really happened to Ragatha. We find her with a slightly corrupted and glitched appearance, very similar to what happens when a character comes into contact with an abstracted. However, this corruption is different. Besides the glitch effect normally caused by contact with an abstracted, her body has small black spots that are slowly starting to spread. Her eyes retain the trademark colors of the abstracted, giving the impression that the transformation is only just beginning. Ragatha stays hidden in a corner, completely terrified, while staring at a strange figure standing right in front of her. It all started when she got separated from the rest of the group during one of the chases. After the abstracted started hunting the inhabitants of the Digital Circus, everyone tried to escape as best they could. The true reason why these creatures are chasing them remains unknown, but they seem to be acting in an increasingly aggressive and violent manner. In a desperate attempt to stop them, the group tried different ways to contain them. They even reused Zubal's ropes to try and capture at least one of them, just like what happened in episode 9. However, Ragatha was too scared. She didn't want to hurt those who had once been her friends, or at least what they had now become, and that ended up being her worst mistake. During one of those chases, Ragatha was left completely isolated from the group and ended up arriving at an area of the Digital Circus she had never seen before. She tried to hide time and time again, but was ultimately found and attacked by one of the creatures. That's when we discover that the one who found her was Jax. Jax just stands there staring at her as if he had been looking specifically for her right from the start. The attack doesn't just hurt her physically, it also begins to alter that new corporeal form she had regained. The right side of her body, especially her arm and part of her face, right where she took the hit, begins to glitch while small dark spots slowly begin to spread, as if they were little by little turning her into a new abstracted. The scene ends with both of them staring at each other in absolute silence, leaving the mystery of what either of them will do next hanging in the air. Abigail manages to bring the Digital Circus to her house using a USB drive, following the advice Pomni gave her. Thanks to that, Grant and Queenie can observe everything happening inside the Digital Circus. Grant, Kinger's human version, is completely amazed by everything he discovers. Abigail introduces him to Pomni, and she herself tells him everything that has happened inside the Digital Circus. He can't believe that such a vast and complex world was created without him or the rest of his team realizing what was really going on behind the project. However, that fascination is very short-lived. Little by little, it begins to turn into horror. From the computer, Grant is able to observe everything everything happening inside the digital circus. He sees the glitched characters, discovers the state Ragatha is in, and witnesses how the few survivors continue fighting to stay alive. Shocked by the situation, he begins desperately looking for a way to rescue them. He makes numerous attempts to access the digital circus directly, but they all fail. The system prevents him from entering the areas where the other characters are located. After several failed attempts, he comes up with a new idea. Instead of trying to physically enter the system, he decides to create new avatars that can be controlled from the real world using virtual reality headsets. That way, he, Queenie, and the others could enter the digital circus to help the survivors without putting their own minds at risk. However, developing a system like that will take him at least one more day. While he keeps working, he tries to communicate with Gangle and Zubul using a channel external to the digital circus. Through it, he tells them the locations where they need to hide to stay safe. They are both completely surprised to hear a voice that clearly doesn't belong to the digital circus. Even so, they decide to follow every single instruction they receive. At that moment, Abigail receives a phone call. It is one of her best friends who tells her he came by to visit because he was very worried about her. Abigail asks Pomni if she would like to go with her to greet him. Pomni accepts without hesitation and replies that she'd love to meet him, but when they both open the door, they discover that the person waiting for them was Leroy Mateo, the real-world version of Jax. The appearance of Jax's human version could completely change the fate of Pomni, Abigail, and the inhabitants of the digital circus. While Grant and Queenie prepare to enter this world, what secrets might Leroy Mateo be hiding? If this video gets enough support, we can continue the story in a part 2. What role do you think Jax will play, and which character would you like to see next? Let us know your thoughts in the comments.